everyone, it's Rachel at the Chattanooga Public Library. Some of you may already know that November is Native American Heritage Month, but did you also know that today, November 27th, is Native American Heritage Day? In 2008, President George W. Bush signed a law to designate the Friday after Thanksgiving as a day to honor and respect the Native American people. Over 184 indigenous tribes supported passing this bill into law. The holiday is intended to create awareness and educate the public on Native Americans' perspective of the Thanksgiving narrative, as well as other indigenous history that commonly gets left out of classrooms and society's collective consciousness. Important events like the Trail of Tears have been introduced to curricula across the nation, in part because of this movement. As we as a nation grapple with our often complicated, unjust origins, we can help make reparations by telling the stories of previously silenced voices and promote members of those communities when they share their experiences. In this video, Linda Moss Mines shares the life and activism of Chief John Ross, an important leader of the Cherokee Nation who also helped found Chattanooga as we know it today.
So I wanted to start first with Chief John Ross, and notice I have a picture so that for those of you that have never spent a lot of time talking to Chief John, I do talk to him occasionally when I visit historical sites. I wanted you to kind of have an idea of what he looked like as a young man, and this is Chief John toward the end of his rule. Chief John Ross was born here in the Hamilton County area in the 1790s. He was the son of a Cherokee mother and a Scottish father. He's actually only 1/8 Cherokee. But he grows up within the Cherokee clans, and his mother was of the Bird clan. Within the Cherokee culture, the mother's line, the maternal line, is how you trace your genealogy. Most of us are very much accustomed to, we take our names from our fathers. He took his name from his father, Daniel Ross, and his grandfather, Alexander Ross. But culturally, he was raised as a Cherokee. When he reaches young adulthood, sort of his tween age, he then is offered the choice, are you going to be Cherokee or do you want to be a white man? And that was the language of the time. And even though he's only 1/8, he realizes that he has a unique opportunity to represent his people, even as a young man. He speaks Cherokee fluently, he speaks English fluently, he is well educated, he writes, he has read most of the great works of literature, and he decides that he will identify for the rest of his life as a Cherokee. He distinguishes himself as a young man at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, serving alongside General Andrew Jackson. In fact, had it not been for the Cherokee Brigade, Jackson probably would have lost that battle. But that's not what really propels him into national prominence. And that's that at a young age, he becomes principal chief of the Cherokee in 1829. And he will remain chief until 1866, the longest serving principal chief of the Cherokee Nation until this day. Now, for those of you who enjoy history, you will automatically begin to think, wait, he was serving as principal chief during the time of the Trail of Tears. And he was. And in fact, many historians credit Chief John Ross for the fact that the Cherokee survived at all as they were transported and moved west. It will be his leadership. He will personally finance. Actually, he personally hires the attorneys that finances the case that he takes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, saying that the land of the Cherokee cannot be taken by the state of Georgia. And if you have any knowledge of that case, or if you haven't, it's a fascinating case to read, because that lawsuit goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court when, guess who is president? Andrew Jackson, his former colleague in battle. And John Marshall, probably the most famous of our chief justices of the 19th century, renders a verdict that says Georgia cannot take the land from the Cherokee. There have been historic treaties. The Cherokee have fought alongside since the Revolutionary War. In the decade following the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee have been our allies. We can't take their land. Andrew Jackson famously says, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. He refuses to use the power of the presidency to keep the Cherokee from being removed. And in fact, John Ross will, upon 5 or 6 occasions, travel to Washington, D.C., speak before Congress, speak to President Jackson, trying to establish those familial ties where they have fought together, blood to blood, writes beautifully eloquent letters, does all of that, and when the final decision is made, the Cherokee will be removed. John Ross comes back from Washington on his last trip to find that his home has been taken by Georgia settlers. His wife and children have been turned out into the night. He doesn't know where they have gone. He eventually locates them. He loses a child during that period of time. Ultimately, he will organize the Cherokee, will pay for provisions, will work with the military, and he will be in charge of their relocation to Oklahoma. I think most of us that have any memory of having had Tennessee history, or maybe have been to John Ross's house in Rossville, or been to Ross's Landing. Right across from Ross's Landing on the north bank of the Tennessee River was one of the launch sites for part of the Cherokee. About 6,000 Cherokee were kept in stockades there where Renaissance Park is today. It's a difficult period in our history to think about. Ross will be among the last group that leaves going to Oklahoma, and he will launch from a historic site up at Blythe's Ferry, which is on the edge of Hamilton County and Meigs County. If you go up Highway 58, beautiful site to visit. If you're out there looking for scavenger hunts, you need to go to Blythe's Ferry. But the story doesn't end there. You know, Ross and his family will be a part of that Trail of Tears. His wife, Elizabeth Quaddy, as she is known within the Cherokee tribe, will die en route and will be buried alongside the road. She will eventually, her body will be relocated to Oklahoma. It is John Ross who will attempt to stabilize the Cherokees once they get to Oklahoma, and will serve as their principal chief until after the American Civil War. Think about having served as principal chief for almost 40 years. So John Ross is one of those figures from local history that I think everyone needs to at least have a passing acquaintance with. Did he make the time? Did he become the outstanding leader that he was? Having that willingness for sacrifice, you know, a sense of integrity to serve his people. Did the times create that for him? I think history will always debate that, but what we do know is that he is considered the greatest of all the Cherokee chiefs, and he's ours. Most of Ross's correspondence survives, and there is a beautiful letter, beautifully written, that he sends to Jackson at the very end, in which he says, "I have always considered you to be my brother." And, you know, you read that line and you think, one of the things that I know working with veterans so often is when you serve in combat next to someone, they have your back, you have their back. That esprit de corps remains until your dying days because you have served together. And yet Jackson will later say he believed it was for their own safety. The state of Georgia had gotten really hostile in the way they were treating the Cherokee. And Jackson will say, well, I did it for their own good. That's open to interpretation.
Well, I used to work at Red Clay State Historic Area, which was the last council ground in Tennessee of the Cherokee. We used to focus a lot on John Ridge, or Major Ridge, and part of the treaty party, and John Ross as the pretty much against that, trying to keep the Cherokee together and in their native homeland, which at the time was a sovereign nation, still is a sovereign nation, sovereign territory.
Chief John never got over the fact that he believed they sold out their rights to their native land. And then once you lose, you know, it depends on who you talk to, 25 to 33% of the Cherokee die in that Trail of Tears, then you wonder about the cost of that decision. Would it have happened at some point in the future? Probably. I mean, if you look at history and how it unfolded, probably it would have happened. But it took someone of tremendous courage to not only stand up to the federal government, but to also spend his entire family fortune in doing it. You know, it's easier for us to espouse principles. It's another thing when we take everything that we have of value, money-wise, and put our family in jeopardy and take a strong position of integrity. So he's in my heart.
Especially in what's happening right now in today's society. You know, this is important to talk about and to kind of see and recognize some of our darker portions of history and what those things actually mean for today as well.
And that's so true. You know, some of the most difficult conversations, in fact, the three people that we're talking about today, but we talk about Cherokee removal, that's a dark chapter in our nation's history. But we have to talk about it. There's a lot to be learned from what happened there, how the government responded, how they might have responded, how the Cherokee Nation responded, all those sorts of things. You look at the American Civil War, and in all of its horror, it happened in our back door. It ripped families apart. It ripped communities apart. And to not have a conversation about, you know, motivating factors, results, everything that came out of the American Civil War, good, the preservation of the Union, bad, you know, the implementation of Jim Crow laws and all those sorts of things. We have to talk about, if there's ever going to be healing, we have to talk about those things.